There is a rule in geopolitics that rarely gets discussed openly, but that every serious strategist understands. Never start a fight you cannot finish, because the most dangerous opponent you will ever face is not the one who screams back at you. It is the one who goes quiet, picks up a calculator, and starts working out exactly how much it will cost you to continue. Washington learned that rule the hard way this week. What began as a tariff announcement on a Tuesday morning has turned into something that none of the people who signed that executive order appear to have fully modeled. The numbers coming out of trading floors in New York, Chicago, and Toronto are telling a story that the political messaging is struggling to keep up with. And the man sitting in Ottawa right now is not panicking, not negotiating, and not asking for anything. He is waiting, and that is the most terrifying thing he could possibly be doing. My name is Tariq. In the next 16 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what is happening between the United States and Canada right now, why the economic weapon that was supposed to produce a quick surrender is instead detonating on the side that fired it, and what the next 30 days could mean for your energy bills, your supply chain, and the broader architecture of Western economic cooperation. Because this is not a bilateral trade dispute, this is a stress test on the entire model of how democratic nations build prosperity together. And the results so far are not going the way anyone in Washington planned. Let us start from the beginning. 3 days ago, a new executive directive landed on desks in Ottawa. The core of it was straightforward enough. A significant tariff increase on Canadian metals entering the United States. That kind of move has precedent. It has been done before. Canadian governments have absorbed it before, complained about it, and eventually worked around it. But buried in the supporting text of this directive was a clause that changed the nature of the action entirely. Federal procurement contracts, roads, bridges, defense hardware, government infrastructure of every kind, were to be restructured to exclude materials of Canadian origin, not taxed at a higher rate. Excluded. The language used the word zero. Zero Canadian content in American federal projects. When the full text reached Ottawa, people who have worked in trade policy for decades reportedly went still, because there is a categorical difference between a tariff and an exclusion. A tariff is a cost. An exclusion is a declaration. It says, we are treating you not as a trading partner, but as a country we are economically severing ourselves from. It is the kind of language you use with adversaries. It is not the language you use with the country whose pipelines keep your refineries running. The Canadian response did not come through diplomatic back channels. It did not come in the form of a politely worded communique expressing disappointment and requesting consultations. It came in the form of 3 concrete, sequential, and carefully calibrated economic moves that landed within 18 hours of the original directive. The first move targeted something that American industrial planners have been quietly anxious about for years. Critical minerals. Canada sits on some of the largest deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and uranium on the planet. These are not luxury commodities. They are the foundational inputs for electric vehicle batteries, advanced defense systems, semiconductor manufacturing, and the entire clean energy transition that American industrial policy has spent the last several years trying to accelerate. Canada did not ban exports of these materials. It introduced an export licensing requirement that routes every shipment through a regulatory review process. In practical terms, that means weeks of delay on every consignment. In modern manufacturing, where supply chains are calibrated to the day, weeks of delay can shut down production lines. The licensing requirement does not need to stop the flow of minerals to inflict serious damage. It just needs to make the flow unpredictable. Unpredictability is often more damaging than outright stoppage because companies cannot plan around it. The second move was the one that caused the sharpest reaction in energy markets. The Canadian energy regulator was directed to open a formal review of pipeline capacity allocations for flows moving south across the border. Approximately 4 million barrels of oil move from Canada into the United States every single day. The refineries in the American Midwest and along the Gulf Coast that process this oil were specifically engineered to handle Canadian heavy crude. The chemistry of the refining process is designed around its particular properties. You cannot simply redirect those facilities to process a different grade of oil from a different source without significant retooling that takes months and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. The pipeline review did not shut anything down. It introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on certainty to function. Within hours of the announcement, crude futures moved. Every dollar increase in oil prices translates directly into higher costs at the pump for American consumers. The review had not changed a single barrel of flow. The announcement alone was enough. The third move was the one with the longest strategic reach. Canada announced the acceleration of formal bilateral trade negotiations with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Not preliminary discussions, not expressions of interest. Accelerated formal negotiations with a stated objective of reaching framework agreements within a compressed timeline. The strategic logic was transparent and deliberate. If the United States has decided that it wants to restructure its relationship with Canada, Canada will restructure its relationships everywhere else. The market for Canadian oil, Canadian minerals, Canadian agricultural products, and Canadian manufacturing capacity is not limited to one buyer. There are other buyers, and several of them responded to Canada's outreach within 24 hours with statements that were warmer and more specific than anyone in Washington appears to have anticipated. Now let us look at what the economic data has actually shown since the directive was signed, because the numbers contain information that the political commentary has largely been avoiding. The auto sector impact was almost immediate. The automotive supply chain between the United States and Canada is arguably the most deeply integrated bilateral manufacturing relationship in the world. A single vehicle rolling off an assembly line in the American Midwest contains components that have crossed the border multiple times during the production process. Engines built in Ontario, transmissions manufactured in Quebec, electronics assembled in Michigan using Canadian-sourced metals, steel formed in Pennsylvania using Canadian iron ore. This is not a supply chain that has Canadian content running through it. This is a supply chain that is Canadian and American simultaneously. You cannot impose a cost barrier at the border of an integrated manufacturing system without imposing it on both sides of the system. The vehicle production cost increases that analysts began projecting within 48 hours of the directive were costs that would ultimately land on American consumers buying American vehicles assembled in American factories. The tariff designed to protect American industry was immediately identified by industry analysts as a cost that American industry would bear. Several major automotive manufacturers moved quickly to make their positions public. Planned expansions were paused, production scheduling reviews were announced. Workforce notifications were issued at facilities that depend on cross-border component flows. The political framing of the directive had been about defending American workers. The actual economic impact was landing on American workers first. The energy market reaction reinforced the same pattern. Natural gas prices in the Northeast United States climbed within hours of the pipeline review announcement. Canada is the largest external supplier of natural gas to the American market. It heats homes across a wide band of the country during winter months. It feeds industrial processes in chemical manufacturing, fertilizer production, and electricity generation across multiple regions. A Goldman Sachs analyst note circulated among institutional investors drew a comparison between a potential Canadian energy flow disruption and historical supply shock events. The comparison was widely noted because of the severity of what those historical events produced in terms of consumer prices and broader economic disruption. The analyst's point was not that a disruption was inevitable. The point was that the vulnerability was real, and that it had been created not by an adversary but by a domestic policy decision. Financial markets reflected a clear directional judgment. American equity indices fell sharply across the first two trading sessions following the directive. The decline was concentrated in sectors directly exposed to the trade relationship. Manufacturing, energy, transportation, and the smaller company indices that track businesses embedded in regional supply chains rather than globally diversified multinationals. Simultaneously, the Canadian dollar held its value with more stability than most currency analysts had projected, and several Canadian financial institutions saw their stock prices rise. Markets were making a statement about where they perceived competence and predictability to reside in this dispute. That statement was uncomfortable for one side and clarifying for the other. To understand why the Canadian response has been as strategically coherent as it has been, you need to understand something about the background of the man directing it. Mark Carney's professional biography reads like a deliberate preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. He studied economics at two of the most rigorous institutions in the English-speaking world. He built his early career navigating the complexities of international financial markets at a level where the transactions involved were large enough to move national economies. He served as the central bank governor of Canada during one of the most severe global financial crises in modern history, and he did so in a way that produced outcomes for the Canadian financial system that were significantly better than those experienced by comparable economies. He was then asked to serve as the central bank governor of the United Kingdom, a position that no Canadian had ever held. And he managed the Bank of England through the economic turbulence of Brexit negotiations, the European sovereign debt pressures of that period, and the shifting monetary policy environment that followed. He has sat across negotiating tables from finance ministers, heads of state, and institutional investors representing some of the largest pools of capital in the world. He has done this repeatedly, under real pressure, with real consequences for real people, and he has done it without any recorded instance of losing his composure or making a decision driven by ego rather than analysis. When the current trade confrontation began, Carney did not reach for the telephone to request a personal meeting. He did not send signals through intermediaries about what kind of concessions might be available. He convened his cabinet, consulted with provincial leaders across the country, and announced a set of countermeasures that were specific, proportionate, legally grounded, and designed to apply maximum pressure at the precise points of American vulnerability that his experience in financial analysis had already identified. The contrast in approach between the two sides has been noted by observers across the political spectrum in multiple countries. One government was operating on the assumption that size and volume produce compliance. The other was operating on the assumption that leverage and timing produce outcomes. In the short-term data available so far, the second assumption has performed better. The deeper strategic question, and the one that will determine how this situation ultimately resolves, is what the actual American interests in this dispute are, and whether those interests are being served by the current approach. Canada is not a peripheral supplier to the American economy. It is deeply embedded in it. The volume of commerce that crosses that border annually is larger than the bilateral trade relationship between any other two countries in recorded economic history. Hundreds of thousands of people cross it daily for work, commerce, education, and family reasons. The energy, mineral, agricultural, and manufacturing interdependencies that have developed over decades of integrated economic development are not surface-level connections. They are structural. They are woven into the physical infrastructure, the corporate supply chains, and the workforce planning of industries that employ millions of Americans in states that carry electoral significance. A policy that treats Canada as an economic adversary does not treat it as something it is not. It creates the adversary that the policy claims to be defending against. It gives Canadian policymakers both the justification and the political support to do what would previously have been considered too economically disruptive to seriously pursue. Reorient trade relationships away from the United States and toward other markets that are willing to engage on terms of mutual respect. That reorientation, if it proceeds, would not be reversible quickly. Trade infrastructure, pipelines, port facilities, manufacturing relationships, procurement contracts, regulatory frameworks, takes years to build and represents sunk investment that shapes commercial decisions for decades. Once Canada builds expanded export capacity for its energy toward Pacific and Atlantic terminals, those terminals do not disappear when the political climate in Washington changes. Once Canadian manufacturers establish production and distribution relationships with European and Asian partners, those relationships do not dissolve because an American administration decides it wants preferential access back. The window for resolving this dispute before structural changes begin is open now. It may not be open for long. Three possible trajectories are visible from the current position. The first is a managed de-escalation. Both governments find enough common ground on specific provisions to allow a face-saving retreat from the most extreme positions. Trade flows normalize. Some version of the existing economic framework is preserved. The damage is real but contained. This outcome requires someone on the American side to make a decision that current public positioning has made politically complicated. The second is a prolonged standoff. Neither side moves significantly, the tariffs remain. The licensing requirements slow mineral flows. The pipeline review generates ongoing uncertainty. Corporate decision-making begins to shift away from cross-border integration and toward national supply chain redundancy. The economic costs accumulate gradually rather than arriving in a single shock. This outcome is damaging to both sides, but potentially more damaging to the side whose population has less economic cushion and whose political system is more sensitive to energy price increases. The third is a permanent realignment. Canada's accelerated trade negotiations with Europe and Asia produce results. New infrastructure is commissioned. New relationships are formalized. The North American Economic Integration Project that has governed continental commerce for 3 decades is replaced by 2 separate systems that interact at arm's length rather than as a unified whole. This outcome would take years to complete, but would be essentially irreversible. The early indicators of whether this path is being taken will be visible within the next few months in the form of concrete commitments, signed framework agreements, and announced infrastructure investments. The global implications of any of these outcomes extend well beyond North America. The economic alliance structures that have governed international trade since the latter half of the 20th century were built on an assumption that the United States would be a reliable, rules-based partner whose commitments could be depended upon. Other nations made long-term economic decisions about what to produce, where to invest, which supply chains to join, based on that assumption. If the current trajectory of American trade policy communicates that the assumption no longer holds, the adjustments that other nations make will reflect that updated assessment. Those adjustments, taken together across dozens of economies, would represent a fundamental shift in how global commerce is organized. Canada is not the only country watching this situation. Every nation that has built economic relationships with the United States based on the expectation of predictable, negotiated, rules-based engagement is observing how this confrontation develops and drawing its own conclusions about what that relationship is worth. The outcome of the next several weeks will tell those nations something important. Either it will tell them that pressure and strategic coherence can produce a return to stable, mutually beneficial engagement, in which case the damage is limited and the lesson is about resilience. Or it will tell them that the integration they built with the American economy is a vulnerability rather than an asset, in which case the restructuring of global trade will accelerate in ways and at a speed that no single government, including the one in Washington, will be able to fully control. The numbers that matter most right now are not the tariff percentages. They are the ones that measure the rate at which permanent decisions are being made, investments committed, contracts signed, infrastructure commissioned. That will define the shape of global commerce for the next generation. Those decisions are being made today, and the people making them are watching very carefully. Stay informed. The situation is moving faster than the official commentary is reflecting. And the gap between what the data shows and what the political messaging claims is, right now, very wide indeed.